What's up, YouTube? Malachi DeBruce, Criminal Offenders Legal Advocacy Group. I always give these caveats up anywhere I'm at. They're all around this office here. Listen, I have to always disclose to the public that I'm not an attorney. I do not engage in the practice of law, but I'm rather a legal support specialist, or in common parlance, a paralegal. I always describe to you the type of services I can and do provide at my office. With that caveat being out of the way, let's talk today about the trauma that is created when a family member, loved one, significant other, spouse, or even yourself finds themselves in the criminal justice system in the United States of America. I know often at times that, there's an expectation that, people will get through life without having any interaction with the police, any interaction with law enforcement, the judicial system, etc. But you and I both know that in this day and age, that's simply not the case. A lot of us, including myself, my criminal history is all around. It's all out there. My story is memorialized in my book, which is called To Plea or Not to Plea, from the mind of an ex-offender who is now a legal support specialist, professional. It's on Amazon, by the way. Shameless plug. But unfortunately, most Americans, by the time they are 22 years old, have had at least one or two interactions with law enforcement. And I don't necessarily mean positive interaction. That means a traffic ticket. That means some sort of city ordinance violation, perhaps, maybe, if you're hanging out or whatever the case may be. Now, this is problematic because we're developing a kind of us against them scenario when we talk about law enforcement, which, depending on how that interaction goes, could equate to you being in the criminal justice system. But there's a trauma that is created each and every time we engage with law enforcement in a negative way. And it does not help that, unfortunately, there have been so many different instances of, abuse of power and things and we see everything each and every day on these many different forums and outlets. So whether it's on a quick Facebook reel or a TikTok video or something, we're constantly inundated with negative interactions between law enforcement, the criminal justice system, and the public. So when you, your family, significant other, or spouse find yourself in that predicament, an automatic trauma is resonated in the back of your mind. And so what that does is that perpetuates the negative stereotype down the line to your family. So let's say me, all right? I'm a middle-aged man. I'm going to get away with that one if y'all let me. But I'm a middle-aged man with children and grandchildren. So my negative interaction, depending on how I relay that interaction to my children, and then they in turn are going to relay the same same perception to their children, and on and on and on. What it does is it creates, if my relaying of the trauma I've endured to my children is given to, if it's given to them in that way, that trauma goes down through generations. All right, almost like the slave trade. Almost like when things were taking place and, you kind of over generations, the transatlantic slave trade produced a whole generational mindset that is here today in a lot of the different people that are of African descent. So this is very problematic because we are not going to be an evolved society, and our criminal justice system cannot evolve if there is continued perpetuated trauma just by mere interaction with the criminal justice system. Not all, police officers are there to traumatize you. Not all, court officials are there to traumatize you. The system is supposed to work one specific way, and this is a conversation that I could probably talk about for hours. And we know that it's not always working optimally. We know that. That is just what it is. But there has to be a way that we can begin to identify ways to alleviate that trauma that takes place from mere police interaction. So this is why it's so problematic, and this is why it's so interesting that we're on this topic. Let's say little Jody here gets pulled over and he has a negative interaction with law enforcement. All right, now he was let go after that negative interaction, but it still resonates in his mind. So little Jody now has developed the perception that all law enforcement officers are not in his beneficial interest. So the next time he may not even be involved in something illegal per se, but let's say he has another interaction with law enforcement. Now this law enforcement officer simply is pulling Jody over for a turn signal violation in this illustration. Jody's whole attitude now is different because of his first interaction. Jody now thinks that this officer is here to screw with him. He thinks that this officer is here to get him in trouble and not simply enforce the traffic violation that Jody committed. And this becomes a problem because Jody's like, oh, this sucker, this guy here, man. And so that could escalate. Jody's attitude based on his perception of the former trauma now could escalate this interaction over a turn signal violation to a disorderly conduct, a resisting arrest, and God forbid into a fatal interaction because Jody's so pissed off. And now let's go down a step further. So now the family of Jody, after this escalated interaction with the law enforcement officer, now has more trauma developed because Jody was only 18. Jody never really got in no trouble. But now here it is, Jody then just either A, called from the police station saying, Mom, Dad, come sign me out because I got disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. Or, God forbid, you're getting a call from the coroner saying Jody was, too aggressive and the officer feared for the safety of his life and Jody's gone. That trauma passes. So I guess ultimately we have to start asking, how do we alleviate this trauma? And, I've been through community policing trainings offered by the United States Department of Justice, and I see how you're trained, and I kind of understand that, but we have to look at an even much more deeper level. And where I'm going with this is that there's got to be a psychological profile that's much better developed for law enforcement, because. And they got to be a little bit more trained is what I'm saying. I think that we have gotten away from the fact that there needs to be, we have armed people dealing with civilians and they have to be psychologists. I mean, and I'm not saying literal psychologists, but they have to be taught at least some modicum of psychology in order to understand how to deal with the public, still enforce the law, but not cause trauma. That's a heavy ticket, isn't it? So, that's one of the things that I talk about. Often at times, this office here, Criminal Offenders Legal Advocacy Group, we end up working with the families of individuals who have, excessive sentences, who have had ineffective assistance of counsel, who have, hundreds of years in jail for, career criminal stuff, and we get these people, review their sentences. But ultimately, like myself and like my own story, the trauma was created in me going back to when I was 17 and I was treated a specific way by a police officer. And that in turn created a whole mess of criminal brush fires for me going throughout my adult years until I was able to break the cycle, break the trauma, deal with the mental health deficiencies developed from that trauma, and produce what you see today and produce a better life for myself, my family, and my generations to come. Because I can now explain to the family how this is supposed to work and what to do and not to do should interaction take place with law enforcement or, God forbid, the criminal justice system. So just a little brief, 10 minutes I wanted to throw out there, 10 or so minutes I wanted to throw out there to you about the trauma that could be caused from interaction with criminal justice system overall and its totality. Let's talk about this, man. Let's get some comments going in the comment section. And, let's start discussing and looking at how we can empower and better our community. And I don't mean just, one small community. I'm talking about the United States. People are looking at never before, they're saying, oh, man, we're headed towards a revolution and, the overall thing in the U.S. Well, with revolution should be an evolution. And the revolution doesn't have to be a physical revolution. It can be a mental, emotional, and spiritual revolution that produces the evolution needed for us as human and humanity to continue to perpetuate itself. Because eventually, we could be no longer here on this planet. Evidence suggests that we've wiped ourselves out many times before. Let's not let that happen. So, thank you for listening to me. As always, my name is Malachi DeBruce of Criminal Offenders Legal Advocacy Group. I'll be coming back to you more and more and more on these YouTubes.